Let's talk the Apple Silicon Macs. Now, I want to start actually, before we get into the hardware, I want to talk about the Big Sur actually, because that's been released, and I'm really flying by the seat of my pants here because I was humming and ahhing about actually installing it on the Mac that we use for the podcast. You know, conventional wisdom is you don't put brand new software on a production machine, but I figured let's see what we can do with it and make sure that if it all works successfully, we'll be right.
Yeah, I've seen that being taken to extremes where one guy I knew was running 8.6 Snow Leopard or something still in 2017. So that's probably taken it a bit far.
Oh, he's got that one app that has to keep working, right?
That was his story.
Yeah, absolutely. Overall, from what I've seen of Big Sur so far, it's actually pretty good. It's it's got the new coat of paint on it, I guess, the new user interface, etc. I quite liked it, and it's interesting in that it kind of brings it closer in line to iOS so that you get a more uniform kind of experience. But they've still managed to keep it as Mac. Like, it's still got the Mac character to it, which is interesting, is that as we talk further in this discussion about the fact that they're using their own chips, just like they're doing with the iPhone and iPad, etc., that arguably they're all becoming one and the same thing almost. It seems like Apple's still attempting to at least have that differentiation between their traditional computers and their new modern mobile devices.
Even though that's shrinking, I think, with the ability to basically use all of your apps on a laptop now, I mean, that's groundbreaking. Look, I love the concept of Apple and their own chips. I think we were talking beforehand anyway. It's not really a new concept for Apple when they had their Motorola chips. They used those chips to forge a difference, which was out of the box. Those old Apples, the G3, G4, and then G5, although the G5 had IBM chips. Basically, those unique chips that no other brand had, were allowing them to do things back in those days, which was video or creative tools. And by all the tests and reviews I've seen so far, not that we've seen any proper reviews yet in mind, we've only heard about what the M1 can do. It sounds like Apple's going back down that path. When everyone's got an i5 or an i7 Intel chip, then the only thing that changes is your operating system. When you have your own operating system and you're building your own chip, then you can start to do things that no one else can do. And that was what Apple was all about. And if this wasn't Steve Jobs' idea, which I reckon it was, probably the last project he signed off on, if it wasn't his idea, then he'd be very happy to see this today.
Oh, absolutely, because he was always wanting to run off on his own, doing his own thing. All right, so with the M1 chip, it's interesting because although it's built for desktop, desktop meaning laptops or desktop computers, the traditional computer per se, it's interesting that they labeled it as the M1 when it's probably, I'm only speculating here, it's probably another variant of what they've been doing in the iPhone and iPad line. Maybe just beefed up a bit more because it's going into an actual computer, so to speak. Although you have to argue whether or not these things are really different on the inside in some ways in respect to that. But what was interesting was, and again, from a marketing perspective, it's M1. It's not like A14, MacBook version or something. They specifically went out of their way to differentiate the two. But what was also interesting is that the three new products they did announce were that the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, and the Mac Mini all have it. So it's unusual because, to differentiate between models, there would actually be a quantitative, if that's the word, difference between the chips that were in them. And that was definitely clear when Intel was across the line. But it seems all that what they've done here, and again, I guess this will be borne out more in reviews and testing, is that the M1 is it's the same chip, but for the Air, for instance, I would guess that they're throttling it a bit because it doesn't have a fan in it and it can't sustain those heavier workloads. whereas they maybe with the Pro they're just letting it run, cut loose kind of thing because it's got the fan in it. And I just find that an interesting approach, and it almost makes me wonder if you're actually buying it on the specs anymore, or if you're having to read the specs, because going from the iPad and the iPhone, for instance, RAM is a consideration when you're buying a computer, but with this setup, I actually wonder if it actually is, because an iPad Pro, for instance, I believe it has 6 gigs of RAM, although they don't officially say that, and it can handle multiple streams of 4K video. And they're offering the MacBook Air with 8 gigs of RAM, and I'm guessing the M1 is supposed to be a faster chip than what's in the iPad. So what else do you need going forward? I mean, if a MacBook Air can handle multiple streams of 4K video, you really need to see what the testing and the reviews will say is the actual difference.
Well, that's right. But, wow, isn't this an exciting time? Because maybe this really is post-PC now. When one chip can do everything with your operating system, and I think that's the key. I mean, Intel will release a similar chip, I'm sure of that, but will the other makers of operating systems and hardware be able to actually conceive and deliver what Apple was delivering here? And I think that's the really, really exciting thing with the M chip. You're right, it must be throttled back, but if you think about the architecture, if they're using the same chip, both machines have only got 2 ports, and I think the top of the range Air is effectively, in terms of spec, seems like the bottom of the range MacBook Pro. So probably if you open them up, except for the absence of the fan, they would be identical inside. So, I mean, it would. I guess on what you're saying, we're heading towards a convergence where it will all be MacBook Air in another 2 years. Just like it's all iPad now, although they call one a Pro, and it's all iPhone, even though they have 4 different versions of the iPhone phone. So what you'll see is the differences will be screen, and I would say, if I hazard a guess, they're down to 5 nanometer technology, which is incredible on that chip. The processing power and the low energy requirement for that chip is amazing, which is why the Air can get away with not having a fan and still doing hardcore video. So if we're at that stage and we think, the hardware doesn't have to get better, but the operating system can, then maybe no MacBook will need a fan in a couple of years, and then you won't need a MacBook Pro. They'll just all be MacBook. I don't even think they'll have Air, will they? They'll just call it MacBook. There'll be iPhone, MacBook, and iPad, and it becomes very easy.
Unless it's they're setting it up to, like, if you have a look at how the iPhone line is presented, the way the iPad line is presented, you're not selecting it really based on specs per se, because it's exactly what you were saying. It's screen size, or
that's right.
Like, for instance, when you're picking an iPhone, you're probably thinking about the size of the phone itself, and the internal storage, and maybe the color, and that's all you're thinking about. And that's where they're going to end up with the Mac line eventually.
Well, you wonder. I mean, let's face it now, with wireless everywhere, and in Australia, people with NBN and whatever else, if you move to cloud-based storage, or you've got a server at home and you store your stuff on there, you're not talking cables anymore. So you don't need more than your 2 ports that they've got there, one for charging and one for connecting your external USB. Your external hard drive, but hey, who uses any of those anymore anyway? So you're right. It really shifts the whole thinking around these machines, and it shifts their usage. The fact that you have a native environment for the same apps on your phone that will now appear in a larger format, whether it's an iPad, a MacBook, or an iPhone is just, it's mind-blowing. I mean, this is a step into the post-PC world, and what I think it will also mean is that you're really breaking down the barriers between individual machines. It allows for 3 machines to be one screen.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Absolutely. I think too, though, if anything, they were a little bit conservative with the design aspect this time, because essentially all they did was they took the current designs and just swapped the chips out effectively. And I think going forward, especially maybe going into next year and the year after that, all these rumored talks of, radically overhauled. It's still going to be a screen with a keyboard and a trackpad, etc., but ones that will look vastly more modern than what the current design and aesthetic is. And also, there doesn't seem to be any reason why they couldn't have a touch screen in a Mac now, because of the fact that you can run iPad and iPhone apps on the Mac as well.
Exactly. And I thought, really that the most generous thing in both the MacBook Pro and Air was that they put in two ports. Considering I think wasn't the last Air, one of the last Airs only had one port. So I mean, that's the way it's going, and you're right. It means now it does make sense, and it probably makes sense to put in a hinge for your MacBook that allows you to flip it inside out like some of the HPs.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to touch quickly on the Mac Mini, because I think that it's, the Mini always kind of is sort of off on the side. It's kind of niche, might be a bit a harsh way to put it, but it's kind of off on the side and has specific use cases. I've always been fascinated by the Mini, even though I can't. There's no justified reason that I would need to get one. Although I do find the concept of that computer really interesting. And I mean, in the past with the Intel chips, I don't think it was ever justified because it simply wasn't fast enough. But with the M1 chip in it, I have to wonder whether it's actually a decent desktop replacement, especially even for like what I've got with the iMac now. Like, I just have to get a screen and it's probably amazing.
100%. I was about to mention that anyway in a slightly different context, but I thought exactly the same thing about the Mini as you did. If it's got that M1 in there and it can do what the MacBook Air can do, then why would you need anything else? And why would you buy an iMac? Because really that means an iMac is what you're purchasing is an overpriced screen. Yeah. You're much better off to go and get yourself a big screen, big, expensive computer monitor, and I'm sure Apple sells those as well. Yeah. But plug your Mini in. Your Mini's portable, your iMac isn't, and away you go. And if everything's going into the cloud, well, then really all you need is, your Mini to connect to your monitor wherever that is, and that can be wireless today as well. So. The Mini is a portable device as well. Where, and you're starting to look at the iMac then and saying, oh, that's pretty last century.
Absolutely.
You can't take it. What do you mean you can't take it with you?
It just doesn't slip under the arm, does it? I guess just to wrap it up with some final points, it'll be an interesting couple of years in terms of the products that they release. They've made, I think, a fairly decent statement with their quote-unquote entry-level products, which is what they've started with here. And I guess maybe as food for thought, what does that mean for when they finally roll out what they truly consider their pro products?
Well, that's right. And gee, after this M1 chip, what is a pro product? I mean, to me, the M1 has reinvented Apple, and I've said this over the last few months. I haven't been this excited about Apple for about 20 years. Over the last 10 years, I've really felt Apple just go to blah, back where they were in the 90s before Steve Jobs returned. Even their $100,000 pro machines that they're selling to Hollywood, big deal. They just have more grunt and they can do it. But now we have a standard chip across a range that is allowing you to edit multiple streams of 4K video. I'm starting to think that there's very little else that you can offer me except the software.
Yeah.
And even then, you know, I just think this is a huge step forward for Apple, and is coming back to unlocking people's creativity again and allowing people to buy something off the shelf that just works and does something amazing and integrates now in this modern age with their whole phone and mobile environment. So, yeah, to me, I'm excited about Apple again, because this is a huge statement, like you say, and this is a huge step in a very traditional Steve Jobs Apple sort of direction, you know. But and I can't see any competitor being able to follow it. So we'll see in the next 2 to 3 years where this goes. But I think this is actually a really exciting development. And if Apple pull this off, then they're going to surge way ahead in the post-PC era.